reform the labor market through the regulation in advance in the housing market. We will also discuss the social housing and family insurance, the unemployment insurance related to the mortgage, the effects of minimum down payment policies, the regulation on the use of fixed-term contracts, and why the 2006 reform in France was a failure. We see that usually policymakers want to weaken job protection in order to make the labor market more efficient. But in our case, we will see that a more regulated housing market will make a higher demand for job protection, which make banks ask for more job security. We will study the housing market on 3 levels. The micro level, which is based on the fact that when young people have a job that is more secure, they will emancipate before. The macro level, which is based on 2 indexes and studies in detail the relationship between the housing market and the labor market. And the housing market is based on the eviction of a tenant that doesn't pay the rent, and the labor market is studied on 3 indexes, which are the regular contract, the dismissal of collective workers, of collective contracts, and the short-term contracts. Here we see that the correlation between the 2 indexes, the housing market index and the labor market index, is positive in all these countries. And we study the correlation, and we see that there is a correlation between the housing market and the labor market, and we see that there is a causal effect from the housing market to the labor market. But we see that there is a high variation squared. So we study the fixed effect regression, and we see that the correlation remains. So we see that there is a causal relationship from the housing market to the labor market. Then we want to see if there are other variables that affect the labor market, and we study these 3 variables. But we see that the only variable that affects the labor market is the trade openness of the country. So if it is a country that is very open to other countries, the country must pay attention to keep the workers in the country. Then we see the model. And in the labor market, we see that a higher level of labor protection will have a lower probability of finding a job, but also a lower probability of losing a job. Then we study the housing market, and the important part is that when the individual will find a job, he will borrow money from a bank. This is the timing of the model. So in the first period, the EPL is set. Then in the second period, the worker will search for a job. In the third period, he will buy a house. And in the fourth period, the productivity of the worker is revealed. And mancano delle parti del... the model is solved backwards. No, non so se era... L'avevo visto che... No. These are the measures of the model, and there are the costs for the firm, theta, which is vacant jobs to unemployed people. Then there is the probability of getting a job, which is P, 1 minus P, which is the probability of default of the worker, and the wage, which is fixed, double B. I don't want to explain in detail this formula, but we see that the profits, these are the profits for the firm, and the worker will get dismissed if the firing costs are higher than the profits for the firm, and this is the cost for the firm. The important part is that both job finding probability and job destruction probability decrease when the firing costs are higher. So here we want to see what is the relationship between the housing market and the labor market, and we see that in perfect competition we have, these are the marginal costs and these are the marginal benefits. The marginal benefits are the mortgage price, the probability of losing the job, and what the bank recoups when the worker defaults. And here we see that the mortgage price for the workers go down when his job is more secure. And this is an important result. And here we see that the utility for the worker depends on the probability of getting a job and on the unit house consumption, which is W over R, and we want to maximize this function and find what is the T star that maximizes this function. And so what is the ideal firing cost, level of firing cost, which maximizes this function? And here we have the marginal benefits that are the probability if the firing costs are higher, there is a higher probability of keeping the job and a lower mortgage price. And the marginal costs are the fact that you will find a job less with a lower facility. Here we see that the relationship between the housing market and the labor market is that T star is non-decreasing in alpha. So when the housing market is highly regulated, also the labor market is highly regulated. It increases. And we see that job security affects the total welfare in two ways. It decreases the probability of dismissals, and it has an effect on the mortgage price that is lower. Here we study the housing, the family support and social housing. We see that if a worker has a family support, this will not change the mortgage price, but will have an effect on the labor market, and will increase the demand for job security. And we see that housing unemployment insurance will be useful because it will not make the demand of job security dependent on the housing market, because workers will be insured, but it doesn't exist in reality, because it is the housing unemployment insurance in reality is incomplete, because people who are high risk workers are excluded from the unemployment insurance. And the minimum down payment policy is also a limit, because workers who want to get a mortgage and want to have access to the credit market, if there is a possibility of having this amount of money, perhaps they will not have it because there is the minimum down payment rush. So we see that this influences the demand for job security, both for poorer people that will not have any demand for job security, and for richer people which will use collateral. And we see that the demand for job security for the people in the middle is first increasing and then decreasing. Here we see that what is the effect of this policy complementarity on the different countries, and we see that in Italy there is both a higher minimum down payment ratio and a higher cost for foreclosure. And we see that this limits the access to having a mortgage for people who are first-time buyers. Is it better to tax short-term contracts or long-term contracts? In the end, it seems to be better to tax short-term contracts because the proportion of long-term contracts will increase, and also young people, although they will get access to the labor market in a more difficult way, prefer to have taxes on the short-term contract because when they will have access to the labor market, they will have a more secure job. What happened in France in 2006? We see that the situation in France was very similar to the one that we have described till now. So there was a highly regulated market, housing market, and the labor market was influenced to this high regulation in the housing market, and people demanded for higher job security. And they introduced a contract that was wanted to weaken job protection, and this wasn't accepted among young people in particular, because probably because the housing market was regulated after the introduction of this contract. If the housing market was regulated before in advance, probably this contract would have been accepted. So this is a model that presents a new way to reform the labor market. Policymakers should make a reform in the housing market in advance, and after they can do a reform in the labor market, and this a new argument behind the political support of job protection.